So I started dance right after school at the age of 19, so pretty late. And I started with jazz. That's how I started in Delhi. I joined twice a week classes that happened in the evenings after college was over. And soon in this period of 3 years, I knew that dance was what I wanted to do. And I knew that actually what I was most interested in was contemporary dance. Because jazz, after a while, for me, I knew that I wasn't quite fulfilled with the idea of projecting and entertaining. And I knew that actually what I wanted to do was to look at how dance and academics could, in a way, sort of come together. And I think for me it was contemporary dance where they did. So that's how I began, and at the end of the 3 years I went to London to study at Laban and finished the degree and worked with Shobna Jaising Dance Company for the next 4 years before I came back, and I've been working at Keli since 2009. I first came into contact with classical Indian form in London. So I had been training at Laban. We were people from about 15-20 countries in that one course, and we were all moving like each other. So I knew that actually somewhere in there I missed some kind of specificity, and I missed being somehow that was possibly the only time where this question of what is Indian and what is the value of Indianness became relevant. In a way, I think that question of identity continued even after joining Shobana's company, which is what I chose because I was hankering for something Indian in London. I realized after having been with the company for 4 years that the diasporic conversation about being an Indian outside in a place like London was exciting for me, but as an outsider, I didn't identify with it. For me, I was quite clearly, home was here, and I knew that being outside was a temporary period, that it wasn't where I wanted to stay. So soon I found a way to come back, and yeah, I've been quite happy about that decision. When I came back from London, there was this. I went through this entire process of, okay, I live here, I make work here, I'm Indian. Does my work have to reference an Indian form? Does it, for it to be a valid contemporary expression in this country? Or does it need to, what is Indian, and whether over time that is even the most relevant question to ask, because actually we've been through all kinds of shifts and fluxes in history. What does qualify as Indian now? After our colonial past, after many invasions, can we clearly define what is Indian? In a way that's for me was a question that I found myself asking when I was back here. So yeah, the first couple of works was really to do with me finding the relationship with Indianness, and also challenging what that could mean. For me, I find through the work that I did with Shobna Jaising and having learned Bharatanatyam on the job, I found that kind of learning of the form very exciting, because we would learn, do a Bharatanatyam class in the morning, and soon after the tea break we were dismantling it. We were really sort of playing with it as if it was a bunch of blocks, building blocks, and making something entirely different, except that you knew that there was a certain kind of essence of the form that you were carrying into the work. Quite apart from the gestures, there was something about the spine that you still carried, which I found quite exciting actually. That the work that we made was was not Bharatanatyam, but yet it carried what we had experienced in the morning, and we sort of dismantled it in various multiple ways. And with each work, it was exciting because you'd sort of looked at the form in a different way altogether. So I think that experience with Bharatanatyam and having made a work, my first full-length work was to do with the vocabulary and the geometry of Bharatanatyam. So what has excited me since is the idea of form. Where does the form sit in the body? How does form get defined? Is it possible to dismantle and talk about the form not in its entirety, but to look at it as a set of principles? Perhaps can we look at gaze as a principle, and can we continue to play with gaze in our work? So in a way, for me, what was exciting about working with Bharatanatyam was all of these things. If you dismantle it, I studied geometry through Bharatanatyam. I studied the gaze. I studied a kind of formality of the line, and a certain kind of coordination between various parts of the body. And I think that has continued into the way that I make work. Although what I make now has nothing to do with Bharatanatyam. So for me, sports is a very exciting place as much as martial arts. Because there's a certain kind of physicality, there are codes, there's training, and there is a kind of an event where things play out. And I'm interested in that, and I think for me choreography is very close to that. So in a way, a football match is as choreographic for me as is a dance piece on a stage. I find Bollywood dance is a very close study of many of the stereotypes that sit in our heads, of gender, of racial identity, national identity, kind of Indianness that plays itself out in a Bollywood dance sequence. It's not apart from our imagination of what the Indian body is. So in a way, looking at Bollywood is a great study of what's going on in our heads, and I find that exciting. I find that in a way, as a popular medium, to be a mirror of society, it's a great one to unpick. What kind of gendered body gets played out has everything to do with the stereotypes we are sitting with in our heads about gender. I think the act of a performance is a political act, because you're representing yourself, you're using your body to, but you are in a way, just like in protest, your body is the tool that's available to you, and with your body you begin to communicate and set up a kind of relationship with your performance. And protest and resistance are actually not very far from each other, because in a way you're standing up, you're speaking up, you're representing yourself, you're asserting your identity, you're being visible, you're making yourself visible, you're making yourself political, you're making the body speak up for itself. All of those things are as much performative as they are protest based. So for me, over time, what has been exciting beginnings for works have been questions around how the body is being imagined, one, how the body is being shaped by various socio-political currents, and how the body is being viewed, performance as well as in life. How do we perceive the body? And for me, that's been exciting that's where the beginnings of works have come out. So I've looked at the idea of, through some of the works, I've looked at the idea of gender, how gender sits in the body, how gender is performed, how gender is, what kinds of stereotypes are we used to watching, and then what happens if that stereotype is altered just a little bit? How do we then view gender? I've looked at sexuality with my the most recent work that I have made, Queen Size, where I've looked at how can intimacy be played out, and how is same-sex intimacy different from other kinds of intimacies. Well, with Queen Size, I'm sort of surprised because we've taken it out we've performed it 50 times in about 20 cities in the country, and we're about to do 10 more in the coming season. So I am surprised, but at the same time, I'm also really heartened by the fact that there are people who are interested in work like this, and in a way there are spaces, programmers, artists who invited the work and have invited other people to view the work and are interested in work like this. So that's heartening. So and that's something new. We haven't had this in India. Say about 10-15 years ago, we didn't have a network, a community of artists at all who could support a work like this. My relationship with my dancers is what I like very often is to continue working with dancers over projects, because then you're not you're not reinventing, you're not sort of building everything from scratch again, because I feel like there is some value to having some shared principles of work which you devise together in a way. So for Queen Size, I worked with dancers I'd worked with before on 2 other projects. So I'm interested in that long-term relationship. What I also value with that relationship is that there is a sense of trust. Very often when you're making work, you don't have clear answers, you don't have clear direction that you're going in. And very often I find myself going, actually I don't know what I'm doing. And for me it's very important that the dancers can trust that not knowing moment. Because I have worked with dancers on a one-off project where they've been like, I don't know what I'm doing. So either you tell me clearly where we're going, otherwise this is getting a little bit difficult for me. And that for me is a moment where my imagination sort of gets blocked. So it's important for me for the dancers to trust this process. And the process usually has, it shifts from project to project, but I devise kind of structures or tasks, and the dancers of course respond to it, propose movement, and I become the editor really. Then I begin to edit, shape, reshape, make things faster, make things quicker, make things slower, do a qualitative brush stroke on movement. So they become the editor in a way. And I actually look at my role very much of an editor. Because when I look at a film editor, I actually identify with that role very much, because I like the idea of repetition, what comes after what, storyboarding. I like those ideas. So in a way, for me, I look at my work through that lens very much. So this was for a project called A Male Ant Has Street Antony. We were looking at masculinity, the ideas of masculinity that sit in our bodies. So what we did as one of the exercises was to step out on the street and begin to just observe men on the street as if we were looking at an alien. Quite sort of distance yourself away from what you already know about the male body or how it needs to be, but just observe what this animal is doing. Where is the curvature in the body? What kind of a walk is it? What kind of alignment of the body it is? What does it do mostly? Is it squatting? Is it leaning? Is it leaning on one hip quite often? Does the shoulder sort of become unequal? I mean, really anatomically study what these bodies were doing and come back with these ideas back in the studio and share them across the team. So like that, we began to just begin to study what's happening in the body, and how do we view same-sex intimacy in a very closed environment. How do we watch something very private in a very public space? How do we begin to share a space with other viewers, where other viewers become part of the work? Their viewing becomes part of the work because they're visible to you as they're watching. So yeah, looking at what viewership really means. So I'm interested in these questions of how the body is imagined, performed, and perceived, and somewhere in there I begin to formulate my work. The large part of the creation process is to do with the body, and for me that's very, very important, that we give ourselves the space and time to really think through what the body has to say. And then of course that performance is visual art. It's what you see. It's the light that falls on the body. It's what you hear. So dance is, as much as it's independent of all these elements, but the viewing becomes an important dimension of making work. And for me, how I set up viewership, what kind of a space is made visible, is a very important part of the making of the work. So it comes much later. I begin to consider these things much later in the process, but the space becomes very, very important for me. So in a way, working with light, working with objects, working with the gaze of the audience, the flow of the audience, the presence of the audience, working with sound becomes central to the work. Well, we don't always know, but while our histories have always been interlinked, where dance in the West historically has been linked to practices in this part of the world, where some of the key pioneers of contemporary dance have been informed by, inspired by images, practices from this part of the world. It's not, one doesn't always consider that as a historical fact. Very often in sort of the historical narratives, that's not something that becomes a question that gets asked or is a known fact to every dancer who studies contemporary dance in Europe and America. In the same way, as much as we can't deny the fact that there is now YouTube makes the world available. So we have the same references from across the world. Somebody sitting in Japan is looking at the same material as somebody sitting in America. What is important to consider though, and I find that very, very important, is to question what is visible. Why does it become more visible than other things? And mostly it's an economical affair. Which countries have the money to make their dance visible, and it's no other way to define it. It has everything to do with economics. It has everything to do with national politics. What kind of dance is the country itself making visible, as its own. Like very often with India, classical dance becomes visible as a representative of, it becomes an image of national identity. So that's another consideration. What is visible and what is making it visible? Unless we're able to consider it, we're not going to be able to say very clearly that we are informed by the dance practice around us without this kind of subjectivity. So for me it's very important that we ask ourselves this question. What are we inspired by? Why are we inspired by it? Quite apart from what is already visible. It can't be a given that yes, Akram Khan's making work, Cyril Abhi's making work, and hi, that's the shape, that's the face of dance in the world. Because that's the only thing visible. There are all kinds of different practices that happen in different parts of the world. So what influences are you choosing and why? Well, in a way, unlike other parts of the world, support for contemporary dance practice isn't necessarily something that the state here is inclined to do, although they're beginning to open up, and there are little tiny grants that are there for experimental dance, it's called. But in the way that the state lacks vision and it very often doesn't know what it wants to support. So only artists get supported once they've already made a body of work and they become a name and they become a national treasure. Do they begin to be recognized? But somehow, sometimes it's too late. You've done the hardest years of your life making work by scrambling for money. And I'm very sure that's been the case with most makers of contemporary dance in this country historically. That yes, now some of the pioneers seem quite state supported or are recognized by the state. But when they were making work and they were sort of in the field trying to make those radical departures, there was no state support then. So for me it's quite important to recognize that actually we all make work despite the state. And so my relationship with the state is, there isn't a relationship there, That's it.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.